Why did Rishi Sunak call the election? Why did the Tories hate young people? Why did Keir Starmer get himself into such a mess over Diane Abbott? Why did Ed Davey end up in the shit? And why, oh why, did Nigel Farage appear on BBC's Question Time last week? Welcome to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just a sort of bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Well, James, it's Florida Frank back in the room, back in the den after my little stint away in Miami. How could Rishi Sunak call a general election whilst I was almost in midair going across to the States? I just tell you that I heard a rumour on the Tuesday evening. I got a text message of somebody quite senior within the Labour Party saying that they'd heard this rumour that Sunak was going to call the election the next day, but they did still think at that stage that it may be a different sort of announcement, and there was all sorts of things being considered, maybe a reshuffle, perhaps something to do with his Rwandan plan. And I was told this on sort of pain of death if I repeated the rumour to anybody else. Well, by Wednesday afternoon, my phone was lighting up with all sorts of people saying, is an election going to be called? And lo and behold, as Joe very eloquently put it in a blog a couple of weeks ago, things could only get wetter. And he made the announcement on the steps of Downing Street, looking, and again, I'll quote Joe, like a wet seal. And then there was all sorts of speculation. I know you two guys had a conversation last week. Your excellent podcast, I have to say. It should go way more often.
Yes.
Was excellent podcast. But I know you reflected
to know what the listening figures were, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Apparently,
I suspect they won't be revealed, Joe. Commercial confidentiality and all that.
They were higher than when I'm here. So, as I say, I need to go away more often. But let me just put my two penneth in as far as the reasoning for his calling the election is concerned. And I do think this has sort of emerged over the past few days in the conversations that take place between journalists and between advisors and so on and so forth. And apparently the clincher, a number of reasons, he didn't think that the economy was going to get much better in terms of the news that he had last week, which was 0.6% growth, higher than expected. Don't think it's going to get much better than that. Doesn't see the Bank of England being able to bring interest rates down before the winter. And of course, doesn't necessarily think that he was going to get a bounce from his conference, whereas Labour were going to get not just a bounce, but also probably an awful lot of money into their campaign coffers. But the clincher, I am told, was that Rwandan policy. And it was looking increasingly likely that the European Court for Human Rights were going to challenge that policy. It would have ended up in the courts, and then he was between a rock and a hard place. He could announce that we were, as the United Kingdom, withdrawing from the ECHR. We would then have joined two other nations across the planet who are not signed up to that convention, Russia and Belarus. And he'd been told by at least two of his cabinet ministers that if he did that, they would resign. He'd also had advice from Lord Call Me Dave Cameron that he wouldn't be best pleased either. But of course, had he not taken that course of action, withdraw from the ECHR, he'd have then saw what was already a trickle of letters going in to Graham Brady as a vote of no confidence in his leadership become a tirade, a barrage. And so he decided that the party at that stage would be unmanageable beyond that particular issue. And he decided the only course of action was for him to call a general election. So the irony, a policy that he actually didn't really believe in, something that was foisted upon the Conservative Party by Boris Johnson, that master politician, got Rishi to go to the polls early. So that's my information. That's the sort of thing that I've been getting told by a number of Conservatives this week, and it's been repeated in the Spectator magazine by Katie Bowles, who ordinarily is quite close and has a finger on the pulse of what's happening internally in the Tory party. So, as I say, those were the reasons that I've been sort of given. What do you make of that, Jim? I know you were saying last week you couldn't understand why I haven't waited to get planes in the sky with refugees going across to Rwanda. Well, it seems he wasn't likely to get that to happen at all.
Yeah, I think you've given a very full explanation from your contacts about Rwanda. I've got much less information on that. It just was fairly apparent that nothing particularly would happen, and if it was challenged in the courts or there were technical problems, the number going over were not credible, you'd have a whole summer spectacle of the Rwanda scheme manifestly failing before everyone's eyes, and of course with the calm seas, the immigrants continuing to come in, because apart from some evidence from Ireland, there's little evidence that this deterrence is actually working. You also touched on the fact that the economic situation and of course the expenditure that's going to have to be made on things like the blood cases and the post office made the idea of an autumn or a September mini budget by the Chancellor impossible. So there was going to be no goodies there. Just a couple of other things from me. I think another calculation was to try and catch reform out. You've seen this disarray over Farage, and Farage more or less admitted it, that if he didn't have 6 months to nurse a constituency, he wasn't going to do it. I think there are other factors as well. I think he wants to work for Trump, and that sort of thing. So I think they wanted to catch reform out and to slightly catch Labour out, because it seems very strange because it's been planned for ages. But with all the selection rows that have slightly derailed Labour this week, the incumbent does have that advantage of putting other political parties on the back front. And also, I think another thing I'd put in the pot, I don't know what Joe thinks, is that the voters appear to be absolutely settled that they want to get rid of the Conservative government. Yeah. And if you deny them the chance to do that for another 6 months, you're just building up the problems. So I think it was that. Just one last thing to say: the anger at the precipitate decision, the position it put a lot of MPs in, trying to make career decisions, who think it's an absolutely suicidal mission, was intense. And I think it's contributed to a lack of morale amongst Conservative MPs, and apparently a complete lack of consultation with the Conservative Central Office about the strategy. I think it was kept so tight that they didn't know anything about it either. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, Jim, and one well made, because you may say that it took Reform and the Labour Party by surprise. Well, bloody hell, it took his own party by surprise as well, which I think was demonstrated by that very poor start to the campaign that the Conservatives had last week. And Joe touched upon some of the shenanigans that they'd suffered from. But Joe, anything that you've heard over the past 7 days or so that sort of indicates to you any reasoning other than those that you gave in last week's podcast as to why he may have gone to the country earlier than most people anticipated?
I think really it comes down to just had enough. And I think, that's partly what Jim's saying, is that the country is crying out for change, whether that's, another Tory government with a different leader, whether it's Reform, whether it's, all of a sudden the Greens or whatever it is. I think people have just had it, up to their necks with politics. And we're now in a position where, after an absolutely disastrous start for the Conservatives, and not made much better by some really appalling photo ops with Rishi Sunak looking like he'd got Mickey Mouse ears and sitting under an exit sign. I was doing an interview the other day with a photographer, the one who got the fabulous photograph of Keir Starmer covered in glitter. And, you know, in my capacity as a former spin doctor, the one thing you do is you look for all the signs like exit, rubbish, way out, and you never let your person sit there. So I can only assume that Dominic Cummings and Alistair Campbell are running Rishi Sunak's campaign, because you couldn't make it much worse. But I think this sense of, you know, there's no point, there's nothing left to gain. What I think is absolutely shocking is Michael Gove and Andrea Leadsom, you know, two veteran Tory MPs and would-be leadership campaigners at various times, decide to stand down after the election has been called. Now that puts their constituency parties in a really, really difficult position, and that is bad for democracy, because it means either central office are going to have to parachute somebody in who's already been passed and is on the cleared candidates list, but probably won't be local, or the local party are going to have to scrabble around and find somebody who can, you know, string a sentence together, hasn't got a dodgy past and might be a credible candidate. But this is not a proper way to run an election in order to give constituents the best choice. And, you know, I keep saying this, but we do not elect a government, we elect a parliament to hold government to account. And if constituents are not given the proper chance to get to know their candidate, then democracy is really suffering.
And incredibly, by all accounts, Gove was one of the people around the cabinet table who were encouraging Sunak to go to the polls early. So, you know, on the one hand,
are you surprised, Frank?
He's got, well, I think if you're going to do that, then you've at least got to be honest enough to say to your colleagues, but by the way, I'm out. Yeah. For him to wait, as you say, until after Sunak has made the announcement, bit disingenuous. And as much as Michael Gove is seen by many as a bit of a slippery character, the fact is that when you speak to people like local government officials, for example, in terms of the job he was doing at the Levelling Up Department, they will tell you that Gove is a serious man. He wants to get things delivered. He wants to get things done. He does have a plan, that word that keeps getting used in this election. And so I think he is a loss to Parliament, actually, for all sorts of reasons. That may surprise some people listening to this, know my views on some other Conservative ministers. But as I say, in terms of that levelling up job, his reputation, pretty good amongst local government leaders, and indeed some Labour mayors and Labour leaders as well. Probably wouldn't want to go public on that. But yeah, he should have, as you say, Joe, you know, if he was going to stand down, he should have certainly made that clear during that cabinet discussion, perhaps. Only a couple of people who really spoke out against Sunak going to the country early, and one of those, Jim, apparently was Esther McVey. Now, she, I wouldn't have thought, was going to be concerned about her own seat, but was probably thinking some of the things that you put forward in the past to delay the election until the autumn. If we do wait, better news may be around the corner. The economy may get a bounce. But Sunak clearly has decided, as you've pointed out today, the game's up. I've got to go now, or the polls are going to get even worse. And listen, that sort of leads me on to where the Tory strategy has gone so far, at least, which seems to be targeting the over 70s. You know, we had this bizarre, you, Jim, but he had this bizarre announcement about national service, which clearly hadn't been properly thought through. He said it was going to be mandatory, and then when James Cleverly was asked the following day, well, does that mean people go to jail? Oh, no, we won't be putting people to jail if they refuse to go on this national service scheme. Well, you know, another minister was saying, oh, well, what we'll do is we'll fine and we'll go to the bank of mum and dad. And so if your kid won't go off to join the army, then, you know, the mum and dad will have to pay the fine. It just didn't seem to me as though it had been thought through properly. And what absolutely confirmed that to be the case was they announced there was going to be a royal commission. Well, political parties always announce there's going to be a royal commission if they haven't got a fucking clue what they're talking about. Yeah, gets them out of the hole. Then he announces a quadruple lock, James. I mean, you'd be on holiday most of the year if that came through. You're bad enough with your triple lock. And again, I'm told by
politics of envy, Frank. It doesn't do you anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm told by quite part of what you would describe as Tories in the know, that this is a deliberate strategy to just sort of hold what we've got. They don't think that they've got any chance of winning this election, but they do think that they can stop it from being the sort of catastrophe that some of the polls are suggesting at the moment. And if they can retain between sort of 170 and 200 seats, that gives them at least a bit of a platform to create and form a decent opposition to Labour and give them a chance of coming back in 5 years. So I'll start with you on this one, Joe. Is this strategy surprising to you, or do you think it's a sensible one given where the Conservatives are at the moment?
I think it's a shocker, frankly, and I think it shows that they are desperate, that they know that they have got a core rump, if you like, of supporters. I mean, we know that people over 65 are far more likely to vote anyway than people under 40, which is all the more reason why young people need to get out there and need to vote and need to make sure they're registered to vote, because otherwise, you know, it's people like Jim and me who are going to decide your future. So why would we care, you know, if the world goes down in flames? And I think it's disingenuous as well of the Conservative Party, because they're not, as I said in my blog last week, they're not dealing with the one issue, which is the really big thing facing anybody in later life, which is the cost of social care. And that is a problem that affects not just the people who need social care, but their families, their grandchildren, their children, and all of that stuff. And that is a really big issue. And there's big issues around housing for older people, so that they're not caught in huge houses, so that they're asset rich but cash poor, and they're not ready to go into sheltered accommodation. There are many, many things that would actually show that a party was looking at policies for older people, but they're not. And they are increasingly desperate. I mean, this morning we've had Kemi Badenoch talking and garbling her way through some nonsensical idea about gender and biological sex, and not being able to answer a straight question on the radio this morning. And you sort of think this is a bit like going to a really mediocre restaurant where you send things back, you complain about the wine, you say that the bread's still frozen. In the end, you just realise that you're not getting anywhere. And you say, we'll just have the bill, please, thanks. And as you go to leave, so the maitre d' comes out and says, please, please, have a drink on us, please, come on. And that's what the Tory party are doing right now. They are at the level of, you know, the free limoncello and the worst Italian restaurant you've ever been to in your life.
Oh, well, I don't think I could top that, Jim, in terms of a description of how the Tory campaign is panning out at the moment. But have you been surprised in terms of this targeting and focus on the sort of over 70s vote, the grey vote, or in your case, the bald vote?
Yes, I have. It seems misguided. I mean, you know, on the national service, you know, the older voters allegedly, with Joe as a great exception, and myself, are in favour of it because they won't have to do it, and the young people are against it because they're going to have to do it. So I mean, you couldn't think of a more divisive idea. You know, there is a discussion to be held around giving young people more meaningful things to do, but that's around far more youth clubs and things like that, and a greater sense of community spirit and things like that, and practical things that can be done along those lines, rather than this scheme, which apparently is going to be paid for out of the Prosperity Fund. That's the thing that's been followed on from European regional aid. So that's a well that's frequently gone to by the Conservatives, so that's what's misguided about it. But just slightly broadening the discussion, it is part of an initiative a day. Now, Joe has beautifully characterised it as a sort of desperately bringing the dishes to the table and taking them away again. I don't know what we feel about it. It does sometimes force Labour to have to react to a whole plethora of things with these initiatives every day, and sometimes they're not comfortable with it. It'll be interesting to see how the gender thing plays out with Sir Keir. So the Tories are obviously doing this as a sort of distraction strategy, but the fundamental problem that Joe makes is, as far as elderly people are concerned, is social care, and that's not being discussed in this election so far. I watched a documentary at the weekend on Theresa May and her to be fair to her attempt to tackle this issue in 2017, which was condemned by Andy Burnham as a death tax, and it disappeared from the agenda. And I think that's the fear of politicians of raising this, but it does need to be raised. But I agree with you. It's at the moment, maybe as we're getting a policy announcement every day, maybe we're going to start to get some stuff addressed towards younger people. But there's nothing about housing, for instance, which is something that really concerns younger people. But we'll just wait and see.
Yeah, I won't hold my breath. But having said that, Labour's campaign hasn't exactly got off to the most auspicious of starts either, largely due to the fact that they've been caught up in this bizarre row over whether Diane Abbott will be able to stand as a Labour candidate in her constituency. And it seems to me that this is a row that was easily avoided. I mean, it's driven me mad, I have to say, the amount of attention that the media have given this particular story, because, for most people drinking down at the Dog and Duck, then it won't be on the agenda at all. But it is the sort of thing that gets the bubble, if I can describe it that way, excited. As I say, it seems to me, Joe, such an easy route to have avoided. Okay, the election was called relatively quickly, and Labour perhaps were not absolutely 100% ready for it. But once Diane had the whip restored, then surely it was just a case of saying, well, if she wants to stand, of course she can stand.
Well, if you go back just a couple of weeks, they should have done this before they embraced Natalie Elphicke. I mean, there's the Labour Party opening its arms with great welcome to a right-wing Tory MP, former Tory MP for Dover, who only the day before she crossed the floor had got her party activists out delivering leaflets attacking Labour's immigration policy. And, we all knew there was going to be an election probably this year, and the Diane Abbott thing has been rumbling on for over a year, and that is incompetent, it's shabby, it has not played out well for Labour. I think you're absolutely right, Frank. I think people in the Dog and Duck couldn't give a damn, because it doesn't make any difference to them, and Diane Abbott is a Marmite personality, but she has served her constituents for a very long time. Last time, 2019, she got 70% of the vote. Now, you can judge an MP by the constituents that vote for them. So the people of Hackney and Stoke Newington must think she's doing something right. And I think it's looked shabby, it's looked nasty, and it could have completely and utterly been avoided. Labour need to be as disciplined in their campaign as they have been in not saying anything to frighten the horses. And the point that Jim made earlier about every new initiative from the Conservatives, which Lord knows it's probably going to be free ice creams on Wednesday by this afternoon, it knocks Labour off course. And the thing about an election campaign is it doesn't take much for you to end up going away from what you want to talk about to something that the other parties want you to be on the back foot on. And I suspect that might be the politics of transgender identification today. It might be defence, it could be all sorts of things. But, the Labour Party need to be absolutely clear, as do all the other parties. They need to be clear. What do we want to talk about? This is what we're going to talk about. We need to make sure all of these nasty bits, these boxes that you trip over on the way out of the front door, are cleared out of the way and dealt with.
Yeah, but you've got to respond, though. I mean, the media is going to immediately say, if this is the thing about Tories setting the agenda. If the Tories say something about gender, Labour's going to be asked about it. So that's exactly what is giving the Tories that initiative. I mean, it's the preparation of the response is important. Sorry, Frank.
No, I think that's fair enough, Jim. And obviously, Labour can't control what the Tories are going to announce, but they can control their own internal politics. And given how good Starmer's team have been at managing the party thus far, it did strike me as surprising that they didn't close down that Diane Abbott story far quicker than they eventually did. And the easiest thing would have been, of course, as I say, once she had the whip restored, the comment from Starmer should have been simply, of course, if Diane wants to go forward as a candidate now, she can. She's made the apology for the unfortunate letter that she'd sent to the Times, I think it was, over a year ago, as Joe said. The investigation has taken place. She's been cleared now, and she can go forward. To leave this hanging in the balance, this question mark as to whether she was going to be allowed to stand as a candidate, then, of course, Diane Abbott gets very upset, rallies her supporters locally, so there's news pictures of that. And because Labour is seen so far ahead in the polls and is expected, fully expected, to be the next government, then of course the media are going to look at these things a little bit more closely than they would if, let's say, it was when Labour were 20 points behind in the polls, for example. So no surprise that the press have sort of got a little bit overexcited over that particular story. The big surprise for me, though, Jim, Labour didn't manage it better.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. The media, the mainstream media, BBC, ITV, have got to rough up Labour a little bit on something. So I think that's why the extensive coverage was given to Diane Abbott. But there's something that we haven't discussed so far. The sequence of events was that in December, this inquiry was wound up. As I understand it, in February, Diane Abbott took a training course on anti-Semitism. And then really damagingly, only on the Friday, Keir Starmer said the investigation is still ongoing. And that he was accused of being a liar by the Conservatives. And I have not heard him convincingly explain that. So what we have here is, because other people were readmitted, had been suspended from the party. So what we had here was a really mishandled thing. It was going to come up anyway. So it should have been handled arguably last December, and she should have been readmitted at that particular point. But I don't think Starmer comes out of it very well. But there is a ruthlessness about this. I mean, Russell Moyle, the Brighton MP, won't be able to stand. The Chingford woman was already putting her leaflets out. She's been removed, and some of the predictable friends of Sir Keir, Torsten Bell of the Resolution Foundation, has been found a seat in South Wales. So this is all going on now. The National Executive will rubber stamp this tomorrow. And but I mean, it was ever thus. I mean, during the Corbyn era, moderates in the party, I could, if we haven't got time to go into it, but the Corbynistas used to purge people as well. So yeah, as I said in my blog, whatever rules you have about selection in any party, and it might even apply to the Lib Dems, the leadership tend to get the candidates they want on by and large, but they should have been relaxed about having Diane Abbott there.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's the point, isn't it? Nobody's going to be surprised that the leadership of a political party is influential over which candidates are going to be selected in particular constituencies. That's ever been the case. But that particular row, as I say, the fact that we're talking about it, it means that it did cut through, at least within the political commentariat, if I can put it that way. Although I do suggest that the voters, by and large, won't actually give a toss. Let's just turn briefly to the Liberal Democrats and my sort of introductory remarks. I said, why did he end up in the shit? And of course, this was his photo opportunity in Windermere, Lake Windermere, where he went to evidence the fact that this wonderful lake in the Lake District was full of sewage, and he decided to get on a water board and then subsequently, inevitably, I suppose, he fell in not once but several times, and there were lots of photos going around of him falling into the lake. And then, he's through the week of the campaign, he's done lots of these sort of bit wacky photo opportunities. Now, again, I would have to say it's working because we're talking about it, and lots of other people are as well. Joe, as somebody who has worked with a much higher profile Liberal Democrat leader in Paddy Ashdown, but given where the Lib Dems are in the polls, currently showing about 9% behind Reform, is this a tactic that is advisable? Because, as I say, at least he's getting attention for what he's doing.
Yeah, and a picture paints 1,000 words, as the old saying goes. And yes, of course, it was deliberate. And of course, it looks like Ed Davey had more fun on half term than thousands of children around the country. He's been on a slide, he's been on a bike, he's been in the water. But as you absolutely rightly say, Frank, we're talking about them. And more importantly, we're talking about their campaign about sewage in rivers and seas, which the Lib Dems have been leading on and have been really, really consistently going on. I mean, I think, you know, the Lib Dems are in a very, very difficult position. They don't have the profile that they used to have. They don't even have, or haven't had, the automatic right to a question at Prime Minister's question time, because they're no longer the third largest party, or weren't in the last Parliament. So they struggle to get any coverage, and it has always been the case that during an election campaign or during the conference period, you know, the ratings go up because they get greater visibility. Now, you know, the Lib Dems did really quite well in the local elections in May, and what they're good at is local campaigning and building a base. And I think Ed Davey is realistic and sensible enough to know that actually they want to use their limited resources to target the seats that they can probably win, not try and do everything everywhere, you know. And if they can take some of those big Tory beast scalps, particularly around the sort of the blue wall, if you like, the sort of Surrey home counties area and some places in the southwest, then they will have achieved quite a lot. And if they get a bigger party in Parliament, then they'll have a bigger voice. But they've done well, I think, on environmental campaigning. And, you know, it's easy to dismiss them, but they are important for many, many reasons. And I think Ed Davey has also, you know, the two things. One is the environment, but also on social care, which we were just talking about. Because of his own personal experience, he has been relentless on talking about something that is not sexy, is not interesting, is going to cost all of us an absolute fortune, whether it's paid for by the taxpayer or out of our own bank accounts. And he's been consistent on that. And I think, you know, we should not dismiss them. We'll see what happens on July the 4th, but I think, you know, there's certainly no pact between the Lib Dems and Labour. But I think, you know, it is quite...
Oh, I think we've lost Jo for a moment. I'm sure we'll get it back in a second, but I think we got the gist of what her view is in terms of Ed Davey's campaigning strategy so far. Jim, the other refreshing thing, Jo again made brief reference to this, was the fact that he had the weekend
I'm
off.
sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay.
I
Jo,
thought it was a cat coming across the screen.
And turn the computer off.
Hey, I'll tell you, this is another Liberal Democrat ploy. Joe Phillips has thrown a cat into the mix to get all the headlines from this.
At least it's not a dead cat.
Oh, yeah.
I was just saying, Joe, you referenced briefly there Ed Davey's personal circumstances. He's got a severely disabled child, I understand. And I thought it was refreshing as well, Jim, that he announced he was having the weekend off the campaign trail to go and look after his care. I thought that was great. But what do you make of his... It's sort of this, as Joe described, you know, it's almost like he's been in a fairground for a week with all these different photo opportunities.
Yes, well, the other benefit, apart from getting national attention, is that Sir Ed has been seen as a rather grey, boring individual. Everybody respects his family background and everything like that. But he's sort of shown himself to be anything but in the last week or so. I mean, there's always a danger that it looks a bit desperate and he's not going to be taken seriously. But, you know, I think, you know, in the circumstances, doing these pictorial stunts is not a bad thing. But overall, I want to sort of darken the mood and challenge Joe on this. I mean, it isn't the Liberal Democrat Party of Paddy Ashdown. It isn't the party that was sharing in government in 2010. It's a much diminished party. And I heard the other day that the danger of this strategy of concentrating on the home counties in the southwest. OK, you beat the Tories now when they're at their lowest ebb and you get into Parliament, but you are very vulnerable to a Tory revival at the next election, and that it's all very well having a narrow strategy, and I'm not sure there's any alternative. But and I'm not saying he's ignoring the north, but I'm not aware that Ed Davey's been north of the M4 so far. You know, that there's dangers going forward in this, that you'd be quite vulnerable to the Conservatives if they revive.
I suppose what they'd say, Jim, is you've got to have a base to work from, and at the moment they haven't. And the point that Joe was making earlier, currently they don't even get the opposition question because the SNP is a bigger party. I would think that they will be larger party than the SNP.
Yeah, but
and
let's
they
take
will hope that if they get those additional seats, they get more resources, they get more airtime, they get more media attention, and they can build from that. I think it's ever thought, isn't it, with third parties, that they're always in danger of losing out to their main opposition, whether that be Labour or Tory, once a revival takes place. I mean, I'm sat in Liverpool now. For many years, the Liberal Democrats led the council here, but as soon as Labour got their act together, then actually they were swept away, and I think they finished fourth in the mayoral campaign recently. So I don't see that as being a legitimate criticism. I think they are where they are.
I'm not saying they should be at this stage trying to get Southport back, because that's gone to Labour. But with Cheadle Hulme and Hazel Grove, I certainly hope to see Sir Ed Davey in those two constituencies, because if they can't take those seats when the Conservatives are so weak, but I don't hear them particularly mentioned on the horizon. That's all.
Do you make of that, Joe? Do you
well, I mean,
have some sympathy with Jim's comments?
I think it's a fair criticism, but I think, you know, the reality is you cannot spread yourself too thinly. And some of us still cringe at the memory of Joe Swinson standing up at the Liberal Democrat conference a few years ago saying, "I stand before you, you know, for the vacancy of Prime Minister." Well, that was as ludicrous as David Steele telling people to go back to their constituencies and prepare for government. What the Lib Dems have got to do, they've got to rebuild themselves. And, you know, they have lost Paddy Ashdown, they have lost Charles Kennedy, they have lost those charismatic national figures, if you like, and they've just got to look as though they can run things properly. And if they can run local authorities with all the challenges that local authorities have, and they can be seen to be sensible, and, you know, going back to what we were saying earlier about selection process, the one thing about the Liberal Democrats is that they do tend to have their candidates in place, mainly because they have to fight so many elections, but they're in place, they're known. And I think that makes a huge difference. And I think, you know, when it comes to it, a lot of this will be about the personalities or lack of personalities of Starmer and Sunak. But a lot of it will be what's happening in my area, what's happening to my local health services, my bus services, you know, my rubbish collections. And the Lib Dems are good at that. I mean, what they need is, you know, Chris Rennard in his pomp was the best campaigner ever, and Jim knows that. And, you know, the Labour Party and the Tories absolutely hated the way the Lib Dems ran local campaigns, because we were very good at it, and they've lost that, but I think they're getting it back. So I think, you know, they've got to work with what they've got. They haven't got the resources, and I think they need to, you know, they'll get more coverage from taking, let's say, Jeremy Hunt's seat than they will by coming a close second in Cheadle Hulme.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I would say, Jim, is last time I looked, Cumbria is in the north. So Ed Davey's definitely been in this neck of the woods, at least once, as I say, dropping himself in the shit for that great photo opportunity. Listen, I'm going to take a short break, and when I come back, we'll be talking about the BBC. And I have to say, unfortunately, not in a positive way. Stick with us. We'll be back in a moment. Hi, it's Frank McKenna here, the Chief Exec and Group Chair of Downtown in Business. And some of you listeners will know that recently I've been in Miami. Now, booking the flights, that was the easy bit. The difficult part was getting to the airport, because you can only get to Miami from Heathrow. And of course, I live in the Northwest. So what are your options? Well, you could try and book a train, hope that it's running on time, and then take on board all the inconvenience of lugging your cases over to, in my case, Lime Street Station, lugging them off at the other end at Euston, and then trying to find a tube station to get you through to Heathrow. The alternative, far easier, far more comfortable, and certainly far more of a luxury experience, is to book Joe Orr and his team at Escape Chauffeurs. So Escape Chauffeurs, Downtown's official chauffeur and travel partner, they will pick you up at your front door. They whizzed us down to London in about 3.5 hours, a couple of stops on the way, Starbucks. Joe had the champagne on ice as well when we got into his luxury Mercedes people carrier. And when we got back from Miami,
when you're absolutely shattered and the last thing you want, as I say, is to be getting on a train, and that's if they're running. There's one of Joe's team waiting to take us back to Liverpool once again, an absolutely first-class service, and made the whole holiday experience just that little bit more special. So if you're interested in luxury travel, rather than relying on the unreliable trains, particularly if you're going on a special holiday or a special occasion that you are celebrating, why not use Downtown's official travel sponsor, that is Escape Chauffeurs. And if you go onto our intro to this particular podcast, you'll see all the details as to how you get in touch. It's info@escapechauffeurs.com, and Joe Orr and his team will be delighted to hear from you.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast, joined this week by Joe Phillips, former advisor to Liberal Democrat leader Paddy Ashdown, and Jim Hancock, the Downtown in business political commentator. And James, as the BBC man, I have to put it to you, I was very disappointed by your former employer. First question time of the general election campaign, who do they have on the panel? Nigel Farage, TV presenter these days, as I understand it, not a candidate. This nominal figure of a president of a business organisation called Reform, but why the hell he should be appearing on Question Time for the 99th time is beyond me. Almost as bizarrely, they had Piers Morgan on the same panel. And then, if not worse, actually, they then put this Trump supporter on the Koonsberg show on Sunday. Some of the comments that she made would have made Fox News blush. And I just wanted to ask you, Jim, seriously, how and who makes the decisions as to the people who appear on these really key political programmes? Who would that decision making be down to?
Well, it would be down. Well, there's a woman called Turness, who's in charge of the BBC news operation at the very highest level, would take an overview of all those sort of programmes. But I mean, that's an overview of the national news and panorama and everything. The actual programme is run by a producer and by an editor, and they take the decisions on who appears. Now, as soon as the general election is called, I mean, you'll remember that the programme was actually brought forward to 8 o'clock in the evening. It wasn't transmitted after the news like it usually is. So obviously special decisions are taken about programmes like that once a general election is called.
This is Question Time, yeah?
Yes, Question Time, yeah. And I think you can be relaxed about this, Frank, that though Reform have had their stint on Question Time this week, there will be a formula for the appearance of the Greens and all the other minor parties in the weeks to come. And it just happened that Reform were given the slot this week. I mean, juxtaposing it with Piers Morgan, who I think there's some history between Mr. Morgan and Mr. Farage. You know, one could dare to suggest that that was to make a good show, you know, and we can't deny that an element of that comes into it.
So it's basically an entertainment programme now, Question Time, isn't it? It's not really a serious political platform anymore.
No, that's completely unfair. So, I mean, that would be the formula.
Well, why is it completely unfair? You've got Piers Morgan. Come on, why? And then you've got Farage, who has already by this stage said, I'm not standing. Has already actually said, beyond that, I'm more interested in the American election. And as I say, has this bizarre title as president of a business organisation that happens to also run candidates for elections. Surely the BBC should have said to Reform, if you want a presence on our flagship political programme, then you're going to have to put someone up who's standing for election. You've got Lee Anderson, who's a sitting MP, who's now Reform. You've got Tice, who is the leader and is standing for a seat. You've got a multitude of other candidates that you can put forward. Why do the BBC bow the knee to Farage every single time he shouts and screams? Are they scared of him?
No. I mean that within the decision making. So we're going down the scale here. So we've got this person in charge of the BBC's news coverage, Turness. Then we've got the producers of the programme, who I've explained will week by week represent the minor parties. But when you approach a party for a nominee, there is always a negotiation. You say we want a spokesperson, and they might have even said we want Richard Tice, and they might have said no, we want to put Nigel Farage up. And so Joe will tell you there's a to and fro, quite a vigorous to and fro very often about who's actually going to appear. Now, there was no doubt at all that he was representing the Reform Party, and there'll be plenty of other examples. I mean, Lord Cameron might well appear representing the Conservative Party, and he's not standing for election.
It's the Foreign Secretary. Jim, come on. You're taking the piss. You're comparing a guy who has given up politics to become a television presenter, who has stated publicly he's more interested in the American presidential election that takes place in November than he is in our general election. You've also got the BBC making one of its news presenters apologise because, having shown, and again why the BBC deemed it necessary to show in full live Farage making some sort of speech at Dover, the news presenter then says, there's Nigel Farage. Basically, I can't remember the exact wording to use, but basically
with his usual vitriolic language. Yeah.
And then she's made to apologise. They are scared of Farage, and I can't understand why.
Well,
the BBC is scared of Farage.
I think just if I can chip in a bit, having been a producer of political programmes for many, many years, it's a nightmare during an election period, and it's not quite as bad as it used to be, but we used to have to tot up the seconds to make sure there was parity, and there were limits on, you couldn't have candidates actually during an election campaign. So that might be the reason that they had Farage, and it might be the reason that they might at some point have Cameron, let's say, because you can't have candidates unless you have the other candidates, so you end up then doing.
Well, Wes Streeting was on, Joe, so that can't be right. Wes Streeting is the other person. He's a candidate.
But this
doesn't kick in till Tuesday.
Cabinet.
There are no candidates.
Kicks in on Tuesday. I mean, as I say, listen, I am always try and defend the BBC. Always try and defend the BBC. I think it's a fabulous institution. It's known worldwide for its neutral and fair news coverage, but to basically compound what was already a bad decision, in my view, and as I say, putting Farage on with the other clown, Piers Morgan, just makes Question Time diminished, in my view.
Well,
just because
I haven't watched Question Time for an awfully long.
It's shocking.
Time. Because it's
sorry, Joe. On Sunday, we then have this Trumpian rolled out, who starts spouting all sorts of falsehoods. It wouldn't bear a fact checking, because there was not one thing that came out of the woman's mouth that was true in terms of the Donald Trump trial, in which he was found guilty on 34 counts. Again, Jim, I ask you, how much of a say would Laura Kuenssberg have as to whether that person should appear on her programme? Because I would imagine that the presenter of a programme, certainly back in your day, I think this was the case, has at least some say in who they're going to be interviewing.
Yeah, well, this is another interesting, and Joe will have a contribution on this, the role of the presenter in editorial decisions. I would generally answer that question by saying it depends on the seniority of the presenter of the programme. And, obviously over the years, as David Dimbleby, Hugh Edwards, people like that go up the greasy pole, what they have to say is taken into account, whereas a rookie new presenter of a program would be heavily dominated by the producer. So I think there's a sort of a balanced stake space.
Where would Laura Kuenssberg fit in?
I think she's pretty well coming up there. But I do think it was strange that. I mean, it's some of it's a time. I know it sounds lame, but some of it's a time issue. They had a lot to get into that program, and I think it would have been desirable to have had a debate, or at least to have had a democratic contribution. What I felt was frustrating, and this wasn't just on Koonsberg, it was on other BBC coverage and other channels as well, was that nobody was making the point that Trump faces far more serious charges. The Georgia interference with that election, I just need 11,000 votes, Brad. That is a far stronger case than this issue of funding, and I think they've made a fundamental mistake in taking them in that particular order. But I'm straying.
That's nothing to do with the BBC, Jim. The point I'm making about the BBC is, in my view, they've made a really bad call in terms of the panel that they've selected for the first general election campaign question time, a programme that's already suffering and losing viewers like Joe, who, you couldn't get anyone more interested in politics. And then on its Sunday flagship programme, they've got a woman who is clearly, I'm sure if they'd have asked her about the election in 2020, she'd say it was stolen. She was somebody who CNN would have, if they'd have had her on a tour, been fact-checking every single minute that she was speaking. And Laura Koonsberg and the BBC have allowed her to have a platform to spout those lies, that misinformation. And Jim, I know some people might say, well, why does it matter? It's America. But you and I know that American politics and the nature and narrative of American politics does influence UK politics and the UK electorate. So again, I ask you the question, why, oh why, was she even allowed to come on?
Well, I think in previous weeks they have had Democratic spokespeople on, and I suppose they would see a balance in that
Democratic spokesman who come on and spout a load of lies. And honestly,
no, a Democratic lawyer defending the decision to prosecute Trump. But I think Laura should have said, but you've got a lot of other cases coming down the line. Are they all conspiracies? Are they, did Joe Biden make Donald Trump say I need 11,000 votes in Georgia? She should have put those sort of questions. But just a general thing, a couple of more defences of the BBC. You may have noticed in the Koonsberg programme there were 2 fact checks done on things that were said by Victoria Atkins and by the Labour's Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Yeah.
So they were fact checked. There are other excellent programmes, although it has been butchered. Newsnight exclusively revealed about Diane Abbott's case being decided last December. The BBC broadcasts a huge amount of material, and they're always going to be vulnerable to criticisms. You quite rightly pointed out a few things that have gone wrong this week, but you just need to look at the quality of the BBC's websites and the way it's covering the election. It's just superb, so they're going to be vulnerable to these criticisms. I'm not, criticisms you make are quite valid in one way, but I think overall we're grateful to the BBC for its coverage.
As a BBC supporter, I have to say, Jim, I was very disappointed, and I don't think they've done themselves any favours whatsoever. And as somebody who, again, has often defended Laura Koonsberg when she gets trolled on social media and gets called a Tory, and then she gets called a Labour and a socialite, and that to me demonstrates somebody who's doing the job properly as a journalist. But I will guess that Laura Koonsberg does have quite a significant say over the guests who go on a programme. And I can't for the life of me imagine why she thought it'd be a good idea to have, as I say, a Trump apologist on, going almost totally unchallenged for 5 minutes and spouting the sort of lies that we see Donald Trump spout on a regular basis. Just sticking with that election in America, that presidential election of May for a second, to bring a bit more depression to this part of the conversation. As you know, I was in Miami last week, and to Victoria's disdain, every Yank that I met, I brought up the fact that there was going to be an election in November and what their view was. And I have to tell you that I did not meet one single American voter who was going to place their cross next to the name of Joe Biden. As far as an awful lot of Floridians are concerned, he's done. He's not been a good president. The economy is not, in their words, doing as well as it did under Donald. and Trump will be getting their vote. So it wasn't in any way, shape or form a scientific poll, but I thought quite instructive in terms of what some Americans are thinking at the moment. And Joe, because we look at these things from afar, and you will be following the presidential race as best you can on news outlets and so on, do you sense that Joe Biden is struggling at the moment, despite those 34 counts of guilt that Donald Trump was sort of found guilty of last week?
It's very hard to tell from a distance, and it is astonishing to me that in a country of such enormous numbers of people that they can only come up with two rather mediocre. Well, one's a complete crook, and the other one is probably slightly past it. I think, where I sit and from a distance, I think Joe Biden has dealt with the Donald Trump stuff very well by basically ignoring it and saying that nobody's above the law. Now let's concentrate on the things that really matter, like trying to bring peace to Gaza. Let's talk about Ukraine, and trying to look more statesmanlike. And I think, in the end, we can't understand the American psyche when it comes to elections, because their system is so complex and so much is about money and so much is about perception. But I think what is really frightening is that if Donald Trump gets re-elected in November, I think the world will be a much more dangerous place. And I think the insularity in Middle America is something that is terrifying. I think it's a threat to most people around the world, whether you're in Ukraine or in Gaza or in Europe. And I think that insularity, that, it's such a vast country. We can talk about local elections, we can talk about by-elections, we know what's going on in Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, or wherever. But, if you live in Boston, you might as well be on the moon compared to Minneapolis. It's just so different. And I don't think we cover it very well. And just to go back a little bit on your point about the BBC, I think it's a real, personally, if I had been producing Question Time, I wouldn't have had Farage and Piers Morgan on. You could have one, separately. Why would you have Piers Morgan on? What is his relevance to anything? He's a former newspaper editor, a sometime TV presenter, and now YouTube presenter. But what is his relevance? What is his analysis? And the other thing I would say is that I think it's a real shame that the BBC feels that it has to not pander to, but it is so terrified of the constant attacks from this outgoing government that it seems to want to go the other way, to sort of, it's, GB News light, if you like. And GB News, we've talked about it before, may or may not be a threat. I don't think it is in terms of viewing figures, but in terms of influence, it's probably got some. And I think, doing political programs that people other than political geeks like us watch has always been a tough call. People aren't interested. They'd rather hear I've been on the radio last week defending Gary Lineker because he's a sports presenter. What he thinks about Gaza has got nothing to do with his job on the television. I just think it's a shame that the people in charge at the BBC are not more robust in defending themselves, because, personally, I'd pay the BBC licence fee just for Jeremy Byrne and Lise Doucette.
Yeah, and that's my... that is my, as I said earlier, disappointment is the only word I can use, because big supporter of the BBC. I was actually, this weekend, they were re-showing Boys from the Black stuff, that drama from the 80s, which made such a social impact on people's consciousnesses in terms of unemployment during that period of time. Some of the stuff the BBC's done is absolutely spectacular. But I think that point you make, Joe, is probably the one that I ought to have made, which is it does seem frit of the right at the moment. And that's the big complaint I would make of the BBC. The idea that, as I say, this American woman, nobody of us have heard of, I can't even remember her name now, but to just allow her, a 5-minute platform on your flagship Sunday morning programme to spout tripe about Donald Trump seemed to me a very, very bizarre decision. I'd make the same criticism, by the way, if it was Channel 4 or ITV, but we do expect better standards from the BBC, I suppose.
Well,
So,
maybe Laura
disappointing.
Koonsberg, should have given her, I didn't see it, but should have given her a harder time. Or the producer should have been shouting in Laura Koonsberg's ear, saying, challenge her, challenge her, challenge her.
Yeah,
You
it
know.
was bizarre.
Just two quick more points on the BBC, and then I'll come back to America from there. One is we'll all be very grateful for the BBC's coverage of the D-Day coverage. That's the BBC at its finest. I do have a criticism of the BBC, but I have a criticism of all the British media. Have you seen any coverage whatsoever of the fact that on Thursday 360 million people throughout the European Union are going to be voting for their parliament? I mean, it's the first time since 1979 we're not taking part. I think it's a very sad occasion, but I think the lack of coverage of what's going to be quite an interesting election. The normal social democrat, Christian democrat centrists are going to be under severe attack from the far right in places like Italy and Germany and Poland, but virtually no coverage at all. But if I can just come back to the American election, let me make this challenging statement that actually we might be in a more dangerous, or the United States might be in a more dangerous position if Donald Trump isn't elected. I mean, there's been some really disturbing stuff about on Twitter and X and so on about that judge needs taking out. There'll be violence. This is and there's a film on at the moment called Civil War, a movie in the cinema. I don't want to up the ante too much, but some of this rhetoric, and if it's a tight election and Biden should scrape in, I really, really do fear. And Joe's quite right. The support for Trump is strong. $36 million were raised in the 24 hours after his conviction, and significantly, they were mostly small donations. We're not talking about corporates and all that sort of stuff. So your straw poll in Florida, Frank, seems to be borne out.
Yeah, well, we'll keep an eye on it. And obviously there is a television debate coming up in June, presidential debate earlier than usual. And we've discussed that previously, Jim, as to why that debate may be happening so early. I did reflect on whether or not the Democrats thought, let's see how Joe does at the debate, and we've still got time to ditch him, but perhaps that's a bit stretching the point a little bit too far. But we've got our own television debate tomorrow, of course, with Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. We will review that next week when we get back together. But before we go, can I ask you, listen, just about 11 days into this general election campaign, I think to be bit uninspiring, to be honest with you, but any highlights for you guys? Joe, I'll start with you.
Yes, my highlight was one that it sort of made the papers, but not like Ed Davey in the sea of shit. Ian Dale, who's a very good friend of mine and a fellow hammer, decided to throw his hat into the ring to be on the selection for Tory candidate for Tunbridge Wells. But within 24 hours, he'd had to withdraw because the local Liberal Democrats had unearthed some comments that he'd made publicly some years ago about how he didn't like the town. Now, I mean, I think he did the right thing. He didn't try to fudge it. He didn't say, oh, that was taken out of context. He didn't, do the weasel words that we hear so often. But I think it's a little microcosm, if you like, of what is going on in political campaigning, that something that you said a long time ago, something that you said on social media, something that you said somewhere will come back to haunt you. But I also think it's about, somebody making the decision, having resigned from his LBC nightly programme in order to maybe be selected as a candidate, and then he's back on air tonight, incidentally. But, I think that the personal decisions that people go through to get involved in politics, and the way that politics can throw you off course, the way events can throw you off course, and the way political careers, maybe they do all end in failure, but political aspirations also can end in failure. But I think that was quite an interesting little illustration of what's going on at local level.
Is Tunbridge Wells a shit place to live, Joe? I don't really.
Well,
you might have some listeners.
It wouldn't be my first choice, I have to say. But what do I know? I like being by the sea. So,
Jim, any highlights from the first 11 days of campaigning?
Well, the highlights are that in a general election campaign, however much things are staged, there are times when the people who aspire to be our Prime Minister do have to face the public face to face. There was the classic, even in Tony Blair in his pomp, when he was cornered by a woman talking about cancer care in Birmingham. I think we still remember that. And there have been a couple of things, both with the Prime Minister, as it happens, that have really struck me as the magnificent exercise of our democracy. One was I think you referred to it earlier on, that young man saying, "Why do you hate young people?" And it was just that's all he said. And it was really an effective question in the context of what we've been talking about. And the other one was somebody much more seriously telling the Prime Minister about how he couldn't go to his mother's funeral while you were partying in Number 10. Two examples of the direct democracy that everybody has to face. Okay, our leaders are temporarily embarrassed by it, and it's a difficult job being a politician in a democracy, but we just need to celebrate that when we think about what's going on in some other parts of the world.
Yeah, well, my highlight absolutely was that young man who, courageous actually. It's not an easy thing to go to a Prime Minister and say, "Well, why do you hate my generation?" which that guy did. And Sunak, I thought, didn't handle it particularly well. He sort of ran away from the guy, didn't he? Saying, "Oh, you'll love it, you'll love it." So didn't handle that particular altercation well. And I thought handled the other mention you made there of the guy in the audience who'd lost somebody during the pandemic. I thought that was woeful response from the Prime Minister. I really did. I thought that was poor. He basically said, "Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss, but wasn't I fantastic in terms of giving furlough and eat out to help out and all those other wonderful things? And of course, I turns up to that party early for a meeting, so it wasn't my fault." Gov. No empathy at all. And again, we've talked about this before, haven't we, Jim? The fact that Sunak just doesn't come across as a politician, does he? Can you imagine Cameron or Blair facing that sort of question from that guy? They'd have almost been tempted to go into the audience and give him a hug, wouldn't they? Whereas Sunak sort of, that's a bit of a pesky question. Let me just tell you how great I am.
Yeah, I think of the three, Ed Davey seems to be enjoying the campaign and seems more relaxed with people than either of the other two. I mean, Sir Keir is a lawyer, Rishi's a financier. Politics have thrust these two men into the position of contesting the prime ministerships, but I think they can't just really, in all honesty, wait for the campaign to be over. I don't think they relish it and enjoy it.
And then I suppose the other highlight, if I can call it that, is the fact that we did at least have one politician on Question Time, and that was Wes Streeting, who I am a great admirer of. I know you are as well, Jim. That Joe's nodding in agreement as well. And I'm just wondering, how many times do you think Labour are going to be able to get Wes on the telly, Jim?
Well, that does raise an interesting question about who is being put forward. They need to be using Wes as much as possible, but if I can also. There was a thing in the paper yesterday about Penny Mordaunt's supporters are pretty fed up that she's not been given a crack of the whip. In fact, I'm struggling. I mean, you occasionally see the Chancellor, but they seem to have decided to make this at the moment.
It's all about Sunak. Badenoch was on this morning.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I should imagine they'll put her back in her box after her disastrous performances this morning. But, what about David Lammy? There's an awful lot of serious foreign affairs stuff going on at the moment, and he's been given or kept at a very low profile amid rumours that Douglas Alexander might replace him if he should get re-elected to Parliament. And there are some very good
sorry, Joe, that won't be a great. That'll be another sort of mini Diane Abbott moment. I mean, I agree with you, but it's a difficult one.
Yeah, but where are there are some good people around on both sides, on all sides in actual fact, but it is tough because you've got, as Jim explained so eloquently a little while ago, you've got producers and editors demanding this, that and the other. You've got media managers and spin doctors saying, no, you can't have this person, we want this person here. And you've got the relentless demands of not just national media, but local media and social media. And you've got to do those visits, and they will take as long as they take. And you can't be seen to be rushing away from a school or an old people's home or a bingo club to go and do an interview with Sky, because that will make you look like you're not interested in ordinary people. So I'm glad I'm not running an election campaign. That's all I would say.
Just on Wes Streeting, though, because he's ubiquitous in terms of his media appearances, but he's fighting quite a tight seat, isn't he, Jim? As I understand it, aren't the Workers' Party putting up quite a strong challenge against him in London?
Yes, they are. I think the majority is about 8,000. He's right next to Sir Ian Duncan Smith, who's retiring from the next door seat. And of course, there's drama in the next door seat with the Labour candidate being removed at the last minute. So it's quite a tight battleground there, and he is being challenged by the Gaza Party. But what is said about the Gaza vote generally is that it won't hurt Labour because the high Muslim population constituencies have huge Labour majorities, and it'll merely slightly damage it. But in Wes's seat, Ilford North, he does face a powerful challenge from a pro-Gaza candidate.
Yeah, I suppose he'll say, he's on national media outlets every 5 minutes. It doesn't do his local campaign any harm either. But listen, we'll wait and see how that pans out. But yeah, it does strike me, as Joe said, there's particular faces that you expect to see on almost a daily basis, whilst others seem to have disappeared. And you and I were talking, Jim, a couple of weeks back before the election was called, as to who the Tories might put up. And we were thinking about people like Esther McVeigh, Gillian Keegan, Coutinho, women who have got strong, authentic voices. Well, I haven't seen any of them on any of the press briefings so far. We'll see. We're only a week into it, so a long time to go, as they say. They think it's all over. Well, it isn't yet. As I said, we'll be back next week. We'll look at that television debate, which takes place on Tuesday on ITV, of course, and see whether Nigel Farage and Piers Morgan are allowed to do a sort of interval, bit of entertainment, get down with the kids. And then we've also got at 5 o'clock this evening, in this podcast, maybe listening to it after that, of course, a massive poll that has been undertaken by Sky News. And this is the same type of poll that was undertaken that predicted, the first prediction, that Theresa May was actually struggling back in 2017. So this is seen as one of the more accurate of the polls that is taken. So 5 o'clock this evening, for those who are interested in watching these things closely, as us three geeks on here in this podcast are, that will be, I think, an early indication of how the campaign is likely to end. Anyway, listen, thanks for being with us for the Downtown Den Politics podcast today. It's been great to be back from Florida, missing the beach and wonderful pina coladas and Bloody Marys that I enjoyed last week. It's always better to be back in the company of Jim and Joe. Be back with us next week, and in the meantime, don't do anything that I wouldn't do. Cheers, guys.